Hi Muti members, so in this video I'm going to introduce a new concept which is going to be hair cards. A lot of you have been asking the best way to approach it. What we're doing is getting an actual in-game character, so this has been used on a live project. I'm going to take you through an example of a workflow that you can use. Then after that, next week you can try it, and then in the workshop we're basically going to create some hair cards together. So hair cards is one of those tricky things. As soon as you type it into YouTube, it just really frustrates me actually, is there's a lot of misleading information. A lot of these videos we wouldn't use for a games engine. So you've got a lot of simulation and a lot of auto-generated processes. In the industry, that's really not the case. We usually manually place things or have custom shaders that are very specific to the engine. So the workflow we're going through is what you would expect of something inside of a studio. So hopefully this can act as some sort of foundation. Then you can use some other videos to see which ones are correct and which ones aren't. But hopefully at the end of it, you should get a better understanding and be more educated in terms of what we're looking for inside of the engine. So just taking a look at the asset, this might be useful for you to familiarize yourself with some of the topics that we're going to talk about. So this is a really simply lit scene. It's like very neutral. The only thing that I have added is some rim lights just so you can see an example of the subsurface scattering of the hair itself and all the shader effects that are happening. So for a haircut like this, the static mesh is roughly, as you can see, about 22K triangles. That's sort of considered mid-range for a games engine or one of the characters. These could easily go up to 100K nowadays. There's different ways of rendering the hair. In this example, it's based on a more realistic style. So clicking on this asset, you'll see that there's a material instance. And then within that material instance, we've got a couple of parameters that change certain features. So for example, like the roughness, how greasy or sweaty or dry the hair is. Then we've also got things like brightness and scattering. So with this shader, it's trying to be a bit more physically accurate. It's taken expressions from the Unreal Paragon asset. So that's probably the one we're going to use. And as you can see that in the material instance, that this shader is fed by a specific set of textures. So it's not usually like you have with the normal workflow where you have base color, normal map. In fact, this system doesn't actually use normal maps. So maybe if you're using Marmoset, you would, because it's so restrictive, you would be using normal maps. But for this workflow, we're going to be plugging it into Unreal Engine. I'm going to show you a really quick way to do that. To understand the workflow a bit better, we usually start with some kind of concept. For this month, I'll be experimenting with this haircut. There's lots of curls and areas to get lots of learning out of. For the high poly, we usually split this into actual sculpted clumps. And that's just so we can get an idea of the silhouette and then use that as a borderline for when we're actually placing the cards. So if you skip that sort of section, it can be quite chaotic when you start to place the cards. Within that workflow is actually creating the hair strands themselves. So for that, we lay out a basic square primitive and basically draw hair strands on top of that. So the hair strands are going to be very important because they give a very specific style. So if you look at this character down in here, if we open up one of the textures, you can see how quite basic texture maps can create some things that are quite complicated. So one of the features you'll see is basically this is going down in density. So usually you have something with 100% of something that can't be seen through, usually forms the basis of the character. And then as we go down the ranks, these slowly get reduced and thinned at each time. So what that basically makes is the illusion of depth. So on the right side is the stuff that's on the outside of the scalps and the hair. And then on the left side is what's on the inside. So we're gonna make some of these maps with a really cool workflow inside of ZBrush.
Do you want to elevate your game art skills? Every month, I introduce a new game art concept focused on your projects. As a member, you'll have access to live monthly workshops and feedback sessions. These are interactive events with live voice chat, screen sharing, and Discord integration. See why students love our community, getting immediate support, guidance, and motivation. All from a game industry artist who has climbed the ranks to an art director, helping over 1,000 students get their degrees at university as a lecturer. Plus, get instant access to hours of exclusive content the moment you join. So what are you waiting for? Join a driven and friendly community who share your passion. Click the join below or link in the description for more details and enjoy the rest of the video.
So once those hair textures are done, we'll then go through a process of baking. So we could either do that in Substance Painter, XNormals, Marmoset. The one that we'll be using is Substance Designer because it can give us more features. For example, we're going to need to make these depth maps, these alphas and the root maps. So we can actually make those manually inside by using our baked textures. As you can see, the master materials can get quite complicated. This is actually a heavily optimized and simplified version of the Paragon shaders. The main areas that we'll be focused on is actually the ability to feed these maps efficiently. Everything else that you see seems quite complicated, but it's changing features at different resolutions and engine scales basically. Or maybe there's some LOD optimizations that are happening based on camera distances. So we can go into this, but it's probably best for a different video. It would take a good couple of hours, let's put it like that. But as a character artist, so say you're making hair, say you're making different objects, you wouldn't really be expected to know this sort of technology. So it's usually more of like a technical artist's job to refine these and then communicate to the artist like how they're meant to use it. So once the textures are done, then the shade is also done. We'll then create an asset like this, which is just floating on top of the character. If you look really closely, you can actually see that this is comprised of flat cards. There's really unique ways that we can hide that. So if it seems that I'm struggling to find a plane, that's the whole point of making good hair, is you're trying to hide the fact that this is just made out of flat geometry. If I were to remove the material like this, you can see all the geometry that it's comprised of. And then the alpha and the shader are doing all the work to give you that depth and the parallaxing and the pixel depth offsets and all these sorts of things. So when you're making characters with short hair, the only difference is that you'll have shorter strands. So you basically have more components that are fitting onto that small texture set. Let's say you've got some curly hair or it's a character creature, then potentially we have hair that's starting to curl around or it's a little bit more specific. When it comes to hair cards, you don't tend to bake the curls into the maps. We actually start to bend it with the geometry itself. What I suggest for anyone who's really first starting out is practice on some long hair. It's a little bit more forgiving. So all the hair is directed in the same direction, and maybe you're choosing about 3 or 5 different layers of hair to basically work with. We take this texture map, we can actually do something quite interesting, so you can see how the layer system is working inside of here. So all I've done is really actually just screenshotted the texture, pasted it in here, and then in Photoshop, I'm going to overlay some blank colors and replug it into the diffuse. People forget that you can do that. You can just literally come into Photoshop and change the textures and replug them back in. I'm just overlaying these each with a slightly different color. And this is something we commonly do in games. So you can bring in an ID map. You might have seen that out of Substance Painter. And it's just a way of almost selecting different maps. So I'm just going to replace that with the diffuse color. And this multicolor thing turns up. But you can see how on the underlay, we've got a nice blue. And that comes from the left side. And then as we go into green, purple, orange, and yellow, you can see how it's slowly dispersing through there. Sometimes it's the case that you'll find you don't use some of the hair that much. The workflow that we're going to go through is really useful because we can just go back and replace that with something that's a little bit more useful. If at any point you get a little bit confused, there's some documentation in the UnrealEngine.com 4.27. It's based on photorealistic characters from Paragon. So it's old content, but it's what's being used in the current engine format. I'll link that so you can access it. Funnily enough, it doesn't actually tell you too much, but it's more of a little bit more like general education when it comes to how hair rendering's done. Okay, so before we get into making the hair cards, if you're currently a member, then come to the May 28th workshop. And if this is a VOD that you're catching up on, go watch that video and see how we got along with basically making those hair cards. So the first thing we want to do is obviously find a concept. We're going to be using this one. There's lots of interesting things that we can play around with in the workshop. So usually with the concept, I spend a lot of time on it just to get a feel for an understanding of how the hair is flowing and how I can translate that into hair cards. So depending on your personal preference, I like to add an adjustment layer in black and white. That just gets rid of the color information so I can focus on the form and the depth and the silhouette and things like that. What you can do is also add levels to it. So levels just going to bring more pixels and depth just so we can see a little bit more of how the geometry is flowing. So your main aim is just clarity basically. So all the photos are going to be different. It's just so we can separate the background and just see a bit clearer in terms of the silhouettes. So you can just see from that levels how it's made it a little bit more clear in terms of like the direction of the hair and also how it's comprised. The first thing we're going to do is get an assessment for the types of card we need, sort of what shape they're going to be and how thick they are. So the first one I really look for is the base layer. So I can see a couple of here that you can't see through. So if I draw it, they're basically hiding in existence. And your main aim is to notice it and then translate that into something that's a little bit more square. So with her base hair, she's got some clumping. Like obviously she's got some hair products in there, so the clumping factor is going to be slightly higher. So that's definitely an observation that you want to make. But also at the same time, the hair is very flat and wispy, and it seems to be feathered at the tips. You can see how it's been cut off. So it's not going to be a squared piece of hair card. It's something that's going to be tapered and shortened at the ends, basically. There may be a couple of unique areas. So you can see that this is very bespoke. So you just have to make a decision as if you want that. So if you do want these bespoke sort of areas, it is going to take up another section on our UV space. So that's something you have to factor in. Usually what I go for is something that's 100, and then the second is going to be like a 50% coverage. The third one's going to be nice and wispy, and then you'll have a little bit of spare space. I always leave this blank just in case while you're working on it, you really want something fresh and new, and then you can go back and make it and then start to use it on your actual character. So get in the habit of actually playing around with this and trying to concept it and make the UV sheet before you actually make the geometry or start to sculpt the concept. So in just experimenting here, we see that that square space might not be able to get the length that we want on this hair strand. So for the accessory areas, we might want to split that further in two and just have some nice longer pieces. And obviously the more pieces that we have, the more variance and the more realistic it looks. So that's what you have to play around with as a game artist, is what you can get around with. So making good hair cards comes from a lot of practice, but if you're using this reference system, it's very useful. Another thing to notice is that in areas, to be honest, I think this is personally Photoshop because I can see a little bit of blending there. So someone's obviously come across and just improved her hair a little bit. But if we were going to extract this, you can see that there are quite big breaks inside of here, like big gaps. So it might be required that we have thinner pieces of hair, maybe splitting this third one directly in two. And then that means we can have something that looks good and splits in different directions. So now we've got an idea of the cards. Come to File, New, create a 1024 pixels square. Now the first thing I like to do is assign this areas by pixels. So about 70% is going to be taken up by the primary hair. So we need a lot of resolution on that. And then the second half is going to be taken up by accessories. So we can change this a little bit later. That's vaguely what you should be aiming for. This section then can be split up into further pieces. So divide this by 3. In general, the thinner the hair piece, so say for example, we have 5 long like this or 6, then the more unique versions we can create because we can combine them together and then they'll look different. The fewer we use, say for example, like 3, we'll see more repetition, but we'll get some more resolution. So that's something you have to play around with. I suggest when you first start, just split this up into 3 and then gain some experience from that and then start to experiment a little bit further. With the third piece, just a little bit of forward planning. They tend to open up a bit more with the stray hairs, they bend, so they need a little bit more width. So it might be an idea just to add a little bit more width on the strays. So I've added the 2 references here, which is the original and basically our concept breakdown. So you're going to be roughly trying to replicate what we observed. So the first one's going to be very thick. Going to create a new layer and then use a black brush, and then we can test this inside of Unreal Engine and Maya and just see if it's functional. Because you want to see it's functional first before you commit to actually going in and creating the physical geometry. That's the trick here. Usually what I do is I draw lots of thin lines which are going to act as the hair. Try and make them as straight as possible, but if they deviate, obviously gives that variation. What we're really looking for is the empty space between. So the first one's quite easy. It's usually just filling it in with lots of little lines. I suggest that when you're doing this, you want to avoid as much variance as possible. So say for example, we have a little straggly hair here. Might be very tempting to do that, but if you imagine it's replicated on the mesh, it's just going to pop up loads of times and the player is going to see that. So the main focus for this first layer is that it's just going to be covering up the scalp and giving us our base form. Doesn't have to be anything fancy because it's going to be covered mostly by the other 2 layers. If you remember when we put the colors on, everything was hidden by the multiple units that were laid on top. The only thing we sort of have to observe is that her hair was quite broken towards the end. Maybe it was like cut quite a lot. So that's the only feature that we're going to put in here. When it comes to Unreal Engine, it tends to like a little bit of feathering so we can dither the pixels back into the skull. So that'll be more obvious when we get into the engine, but it's just again a little bit of forward planning if you want to zoom back into this part of the video. Usually I keep 1 or 2 longer gaps. There's nothing worse than just a flat piece of geometry with normals on it. You do want to make use of the opacity if you can do it. So maybe just 1 or 2 little gap openings that you can play with. Okay, so the next one's very similar. Only a slight difference is that there are some more openings. Maybe they're completely see-through, but mostly they're quite flat as well. So you have a couple of options. You can duplicate the original or just start to draw them back again. Usually what I do is basically draw the openings first and then try and paint around them slightly. So if you're getting the gist of this, it's not really about the hair. It's all about the silhouette and where the space is opening inside of the hair. When I'm painting these concepts, I'm sort of roughly doing my eyes. and then looking back at this reference, just trying to copy the flow language. And if you follow that sort of route, it will come out quite similar. And obviously it's a thing you have to train, but again, this is always a concept. So all the 3D stuff that we do, we can just come back in and change it anyway. So this is just a nice guidance system, because it's harder to place 3D geometry while looking at reference. Okay, so now with her hair, she doesn't have too many flyaways. I mean, we've got some very, very thin pieces of geometry. What we tend to do in games, depending on the quality, we'd actually make that physical geometry, you know, the wiry hairs that are going about the place. So I wouldn't suggest putting that into the texture. The outermost layer of her hair are basically these thinner pieces, but they're still quite clumped together. We've still got space for this unique area. So that's on the green side. So it might be worth trying to replicate this this Photoshop section where there's like individual pieces of hair. So what I'm going to do is split this purple one into 2 really long strands. And then you'll see how we can add these individual strands back on the originals, and it will create some unique versions. It's worth coming back to the color plate and then splitting this in 2, because when it comes to the UV maps, we do want a straight edge. So if we have any sort of overlapping, it's going to result in more geometry. So we definitely want to have these quite flat. I'm also going to eat a little bit into our accessory area, because we might not need as much accessory area as a thirst for. Cool little technique here is if you press I, it's going to be the color picker, and then you can redraw the pixels back over with the rectangle. Another funny one you can do is if you come to the selector, just select that component or that cross section, Control T, and then you can basically scale it outwards to absorb a little bit more. So it's a bit more nice, because you can go back and forth and just like see the preview almost. So the final ones, we're going to make these thin, but we're also going to have them quite heavily tapered. So it also could be the case that because these are so short, in comparison, we might have a little bit of spare space at the bottom to add some more stuff. So we can play around with that. Let's make this one first long. There's nothing worse than having a short piece of hair and then trying to make it long, because you have a lot of pixel stretching. So if you imagine if you wanted to make a shorter piece of hair out of this UV, it'd be very simple just to cut it right there, and then it's easy. Whereas if we had this really short section here and then stretched it out, it wouldn't work. So always make it a little bit longer than you first think, and it's going to save you down the line. So that's a little bit of, that's from experience. And remember guys, you really want this to look as boring as possible. I think one of the tricks that people go down when I'm teaching is that they try and make it look really fancy and artistic, when actually what you want to do is make this look as boring and crappy as possible and uninteresting, because all the interest comes out of the placement of the hair cards basically. So follow that route and things will start to look pretty good. So with the accessories, something that someone might do, and it would be affecting them down the line, is changing the direction of the hair. So for example, if they were drawing it up this way, then it causes complications down the line. We would then have to implement something called a flow map, and then that's more expensive for the game's engine. So when you are drawing these, try and keep them all in the same direction. So for the accessories that I'm drawing here, I want to aim it downwards. And also when you're drawing it, try and refrain from overlapping these too much. So it can be tempting because you're making use of the UV space, but then again, it does cause problems when it comes to geometry. So try and imagine invisible squares around these sections, and it also causes problems if we want to come back in and basically repair this area or completely change the style of the hair. If we have a unique cutout or a unique UV, then it just takes away that option. So think about those squares. I'll also show you another benefit about concepting here. So for example, we've made these and we can pack them a bit more tightly inside of Photoshop instead of the 3D or inside of the engine, which would kind of suck. So once you've got the concepts, you can just box select these and then start to transform them back into place. So we could get away with basically squeezing these. So if I hold Control and T, it's transform. Then if I hold Control to move the point, you can see how it's squishing itself. So it might be the case that we can actually fit multiple sections inside of here. And again, trying to adhere to those boxy shapes. When you're scaling these as well, you basically want to make sure that the hair strands are all of similar thickness. So if you imagine you had like something that was small, we just get texture differences and that won't look so good. So try and keep these all to scale. So if it's small hair, make it small. If it's long hair, make it proportionally long inside of the set here. Okay, so for the time being, I'm going to leave it like that, just so we can see the advantage of coming back to this and then changing it later. Okay, now comes the part I really enjoy, which is the proof of concept for the textures. So here's the Maya version. You can actually see all the geometry here. Something that people usually do is they put a central line down the hair, but that actually doubles the amount of geometry. So a little trick you can do is just duplicate the geometry itself, and it's exactly the same as having a edge right down the middle. So it's a little trick, and you can have this nice integration of overlaps and stuff, but you'll see how that happens a little bit later. What we're interested in is basically the bold version of her. So it looks a bit funny, but it's a nice base to work from. Coming back into Photoshop, what we can do is press Control A. It's a nice little trick. It's going to select all the layers, and if you can Control, Shift, and C. But before doing that, definitely hide the color layer there. And then Control, Shift, and V is going to paste this. So we've now got like a baked version of it almost. Now, if you press Control I, it's then going to invert that. Now this is turned into our alpha basically. So we can start to test around with this in Maya. What I like to do is bring in a basic plane, then come up to the attributes editor and polyplane 1. You can turn the subdivisions down to 1 just so it's easy to cut up basically. Hold right click, then come down to assign new material. Use a Lambert. In transparency, you can click this little checker. We then want to click file. Coming back into Photoshop, go to file, export. We can export this as a quick PNG. Back into Maya, come to image name and then click the little folder. Find the PNG and then open it. You'll see that nothing has happened. Chances are that you don't have textures enabled. So come up to this section and you'll find a little circle with a checker map in there. That means we can preview our transparency. If you want to find this material again, you can always come up to the hypershader, which is just a blue circle with a white circle inside of it. From here, we can play around with things like color. You could even come into Photoshop and then start to put gradients in there and all sorts. What we're mainly interested in is just something that's white, to be honest. Okay, from here we can get a little bit of a preview of what's to come when we actually render and start to cut this up. The only this time we're going to do it very, very quickly. So if you come into multi-cut, usually what I like to do is duplicate this plate first, just so we have a backup version. So Control D and then bring it to the side, back into multi-cut, and if you hold Control, it's going to slice this up into different sections. So you can see why it's important that we put this into different sections and squares, because it's going to be a lot easier. What we can do now is get our reference back. And with this cut up section, if we click here and then hold Shift and right click, you can come down to duplicate face. What that's going to do is basically going to bring it into the testing ground where we can experiment with the geometry. So when you first move it, the pivot point's broken. It's also not part of the mesh. So if you come to base face mode, you can then start to move this about on its own. In the top section, there's this little Triforce or center bit that's very useful. So now everything's going to rotate around that central area. If you hold D, we can then move this pivot, and I'd move it to the root ball. Okay, so from this point, it's a case of experimentation. So you might want to get the first piece and roughly position it where you believed that it'd be useful. So for example, if we focus on the front of her hair, we can see that there's a very definitive direction that's going on here. So we need to test this texture just to make sure that it's working okay. What I will do is make this a slightly darker color, just so it's easier to see on the gray background and the white character. So you can change these in any sort of color you want. So with this kind of geometry, what we could do is we select the two edges, and then if you come to connect, and then with segment selection activated, we can then hold the middle mouse button and then just scroll this sideways. It's giving us more vertices so we can actually make this bend transition, and then press enter. So from here, you can use all sorts of deformers up in the top section, like bends and lattices, or have them follow splines. What I really prefer is just to move things manually. So if you come to vertex, you can actually select and then press B for a soft selection. You can see there's a massive gradient that changes here. So if you hold B, you can change the size of that gradient by holding left click and then scrolling up and down. With a really big gradient, what you can do is make use of rotations, and you can see what's happening here. We've got some texture distortions, and we've got some other factors that are happening. So it's usually dependent on the shape of the hair. So you can see that we don't have one clean bend. It's sort of like bends one way and then bends the other again. So chances are we'd have to make something with a little bit more geometry. So again, as this is the testing area, we can just sort of play around and see what works. So for example, with the tip, we could potentially decrease the size of this, see if it maintains its realism. Let's see if we can sort of squish this and see what happens there. So with hair strands, you can basically get away with quite a lot of distortion and stretching, especially in the length of the hair itself. So that's why it's really important to keep the hair mostly straight, because if you imagine we had a bit of a side piece, it wouldn't be able to stretch as far because it wouldn't look as realistic. But when you've got hair like this, especially for long hair, a lot of people ask how you make super long hair. We just stretch it super long like that, and the normals and pixels are all the same. It just has a kind of like thinning effect. So don't worry about sort of lateral stretching there. Remember that you can always change the size of your soft select. So there's nothing wrong with just budging these really softly, just like you do in ZBrush to get the shape that you desire. Don't worry about how the geometry is looking. You really want to focus on how the texture looks. So as long as the texture looks good, that's the only thing you should worry about. So it might be the case that you're actually moving a couple of these around. The general rule of thumb is you want to keep them as square as possible. That means that the pixels are going to be quite nice. But again, this is just for testing, getting a feel for the hair cards and seeing that if we need to make any adjustments. So with that base layer that we used, we usually find that we use it as almost like a fill. So if you look at this part of her hair, you can't see through it much. So what we would do is basically create a wall of hair, and it doesn't have to look good because it's going to be covered by the other bits of asset that we've made. So what you're really searching for is a bit of silhouette. So I wouldn't spend too long on this, but you can basically start to construct a main shape. And you can see how already we haven't even baked any textures or any geometry, and it's starting to take the form of hair just from the alphas. And eventually when it comes down to it, we can select all of these at once and then start to morph them together. Okay, so we're proof of concepting that sort of section. Obviously it blends back into the head a little bit nice and is also blending between these two areas. Next we can experiment with the second section. So select face, just as similar as come to duplicate face and then drag it off to the side. Back into object mode. We'll move the pivot point and then press D to move it to the root section. Now for this bit of hair, what I'm really looking for to test is basically that it can blend a silhouette that I can see. So what we can do is just add some edges really quickly. So as you see, we haven't got the textures or any sort of like unique lighting. So the black's getting caught back on itself. So a cool trick for that is if you come back to the hyper shader, make sure we call this hair, maybe underscore base. After that, you can select it here and then Control C and Control V it. You'll then create a second version. So what we'll call is this hair layer 2 or strands or anything that you want to do. With that done, you can select the second hair strand, or you can right click, is one of my favorites, and then go to assign existing material and then select the new one we made, so hair layer 2. Okay, so what I did was change the color to a teal, and this has popped up something interesting. So it's nice we're sorting this out first. You'll see that Maya's having a little bit of confusion with sorting the Z axis or the Z depth. So to fix that, if you come up into the renderer in viewport 2, open this up, and then in the transparency algorithm, you want to change this from object sorting to depth peeling. And now it's a little bit more accurate. So from here, what I'm going to do is roughly position the start and the end point in the same direction. And then I'll get the vertices, just select the middle section, then pull it out. Now it'll be important how the bend curve is formed. You'll see as I drag this out, it has a slightly different effect. So you can always change the fall off here. So if you go into the move tool and then just double click that, it'll give you loads of settings. One of them is soft selection. You can change the shape of the style. So sometimes that can be useful when moving hair. You can see how this has a more like a linear progression. Some of them fall off and some of them are sort of like staggered. So just experiment around with that. And remember, you don't have to use Maya for these. You can use sort of like Blender. You can even come into ZBrush and import these and start to budge them around with the move tool. The only issue with ZBrush is it doesn't have very good transparency. So you won't be able to preview it that well. So with this, I'm just budging it around, almost just proving the concept. And when it comes to it, it's totally okay to come back to the base and move that downwards just so we can achieve a bit more interesting silhouette. So I can tuck that one back in, come back to the other one that we made, and then pull this out. You can see there's a nicer silhouette. I'm now going to be experimenting with the third layer. So a cool little trick just to get used to how textures interact with geometry. We can actually come back to Photoshop and then just basically export this color texture. Same process as last time with quick export PNG. So exactly same process. You come into color and then click the checker, find the color profile, and then just assign it. So we've got two things that are assigned, is the color map, and then down here we've also got the alpha. So they're both feeding out of Photoshop, only this time it's a little bit easier to see what's going on. So with the third strands, a feature that you'll commonly see, and I've basically drawn it in slightly here, is that they fade out into individual strands or individual hairs. So these ones are super useful for blending it back into the skull. So that's one of the beneficial features of the showcase. So we can basically like duplicate this around and then just have a nicer blend. The same again, just position things. I wouldn't worry about the spare space at the top. So in games, we can always just delete that geometry and it's totally fine. Or we can just replace it with another kind of texture. And here we're just seeing how the silhouettes are blending into each other, whether the spare gaps that we've got are working well. There's going to be loads of things that pop up when you're first doing this. From my experience of doing hair, it seems that it's kind of like working out first time, but I can assure you the difference between maybe like 4 hair strands or single hairs at the bottom compared to like something that's thicker will make a really big difference. But we'll do a little review on what we've done here, and then we'll transfer that over to 3D basically. But it's nicer to see the practical example of like what does work and what doesn't work when it comes to hair cards. The worst thing we could have done is just sort of like I show you how to perfectly make some hair cards without the reasoning of how things are set up in the textures basically. So for the final 2, we can just test out these ones. I'm gonna hold multi-cut and then control and then cut across here. So these little bits we made, we're trying to replicate the blending of the crown and basically like how it splits off into the shave sections. So again, just making use of the hair colors, we're gonna position this slightly on the outside. You'll see how a lot of these hairs are floating. Obviously, it's just for the concept. We don't care too much about it, but that's totally a technique to give the illusion that the hair is blending back into the hair. So often the mistake that people make is thinking that the texture actually physically has to touch the head. But if you're smart enough and you angle enough geometry in very particular ways, so for example, if we hatch it back and forth like this, you'll see that the textures aren't actually touching the head, but from a distance, it looks like they are. So when you have many of them and you rotate around the character, it just looks like they're all attached. And that's the difference between like a good blend and a bad blend. But when we actually come to make the hair texture, that'll become more apparent. So funnily enough, I think this card here is very similar to this section. That was the one I was trying to replicate. So I think that's got a tick. You know, it's working well, it blends, and it also tapers towards the top. This one's slightly similar, but with a bit of variance and more curve. And I think it's working well. It could be that we duplicate this again and then make sort of something that's a bit more unique, maybe scale it up or make it longer. And it's totally fine to warp this in all directions. You can see how this is all twisting. Again, as long as the texture is looking okay and the thickness of the hair is all right. So you can see how after a while we layer this up and refine it, it's gonna be looking quite good. Okay, so before we move on to actually making the hair and rendering it and testing it inside of Unreal Engine, we first want to make a couple of observations. That was the whole point about this process. So I think what did work was the flyaways. So I'm pretty happy with that. Maybe an adjustment that we can make is on the filling cards. So they do their job in the center, as in they're basically filling this area quite well. But when it comes to the silhouettes, this squareness is actually causing a lot of problems. So it might be a case that we'd have benefits to cut inside of it, very similar to how we've done with the yellow one. So what I would do is when I come into Photoshop, we could even make that change right now. You know, just come into Photoshop, get the eraser, and then just eat into that slightly. Doesn't have to be anything fancy. Basically what I'm doing here is I'm actually using my mouse just to like get the shape there. Okay, so what we've done in here is just like cut back into it. You can see the difference between what we had before and the version after. So again, what we could do is hide the color background, press Ctrl A, Ctrl Shift C, Ctrl Shift V, Ctrl I to invert it. Seems I added some random colors here, so I just have to get rid of that. Want to re-export this as a PNG, and we can overwrite the original, so the card testing, press save. Then we also want to come back into Maya. So sometimes this takes a little bit long to update. Usually it's a bug if you open the hypershader, then close it. Sometimes it works. You'll have to close it and open it a couple of times. But now you can see how we've made that implementation. So now it's cut in and that silhouette's looking better. You can see it's much closer to the reference. Now we can take that forth into the 3D asset. It's going to be much better. Another change we can make is potentially on the yellow area. So you can see how this is quite thin. So the gaps are really good. That's basically like a tick mark. But I think that these areas could use with a little bit of thickening, a bit more clumping, and then that'll be closer to the reference that we can see here. So if you look, it's quite thin. It's all like stacked together, and we can just introduce that on the second layer. It's going to be more accurate. It's going to work a little bit better. There's nothing worse than having like loads of small wispy hairs that just sort of like blend into nothing. You really want it to clump together so you can see it, especially for a distance and for game characters. So here we've really laid the foundation for the perfect kind of workflow. We selected a reference and then broke that up with a 4 strategy, so it would save us time. We then added like a quite a unique second layer of strategy. So testing out our concepts like our theories. So painting them very quickly inside of Photoshop so we can quickly iterate. If you imagine this was 3D, that would have been very, very difficult. So we just hop back and forth, make really quick edits, review our progress, because at the end of the day, these textures are for use inside of Maya, so we know how to move cards around. So now that we've got the changes that we're going to make, on the second layer, we're going to like thicken that up a bit. We've already made the adjustment to the base layer, so it's matching the reference a lot better. We've really laid the foundation for a really nice render and 3D texture. So click on the next video. We're going to go into actually creating the hair strands, physical geometry, and exporting the maps perfectly so they hook and integrate into Unreal Engine really nicely. So it's important that we ace those materials. And we'll also dabble a bit inside a Substance Designer to create things like root maps and depth maps that are going to feed the shader. So really excited to show you that. No XGen needed. It's a really super fast workflow. It's also a really open and dynamic workflow. And also, if you wanted to go into XGen afterwards, if you really wanted to, you can go back over that system and reintegrate it. So there's really open and unique ways to do things here. After that, you should be set to basically practice and integrate what you've learned in these 2 videos that are coming up. And then for the third and final one, we'll all get together in the members and create the hair cards and do placement and just experience what that's like. I'll show you a couple of techniques live, and then we can actually create this hair after we've made all the smaller components. So catch you on the next ones.